So there you have President Cyril Ramaphosa announcing then his government's response to the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. When one looks at it holistically, it really deals with a lot of legislative reforms, very broad on what those exactly will look like, but certainly the President committing to fine-tuning some of the legislative and regulatory frameworks that have come out as recommendations from the Zondo Commission of Inquiry in ensuring that a state capture does not happen. You heard there 350 findings that needed to be implemented in as far as recommendations are concerned. And the President making it clear that not all the recommendations are binding on him, and that it really is his prerogative alongside his cabinet to look at what exactly can be and needs to be implemented, and what it is that they need to pause, put on the side for further review. So you heard there, among the key announcements that have been made today is including the reforms when it comes to the procurement processes, the law that govern procurement processes, and how those need to change going to future. They limit the role of ministers, limit the role even of the board when it comes to decisions around procurement. The President also touching on the question of accountability, saying he's mindful of the findings made against members of the executive, but also notes, the recommendations finding in as far as the failure of Parliament is concerned. He says the Deputy President, David Mabuza, will now be the intermediary of sort, working with Parliament to hear how exactly they're going to be strengthening their work, and if in fact that will need any adjustments to their budgets to ensure that they are more effective. He does, of course, say that there is that separation of powers that he will need to protect, or that he will need to be mindful of when it comes to what exactly it is Parliament can do and the role and the work of strengthening Parliament. We also have the President talking about the question of the electoral reform. You'd remember it was one of the more controversial findings and recommendations of the Zondo Commission of Inquiry when it came to what the Chief Justice believes our constitutional framework, our electoral framework needs to look like in as far as curbing corruption is concerned. And the President says, well, that is a complex matter, and he's going to leave it again in the hands of Parliament and South Africa, as that would require some constitutional changes. So lots of broad changes then expected in the coming months and years in as far as the recommendations of this report are concerned. We'll get your reaction to it in a moment. I understand Build One South Africa leader Mmusi Maimane is standing by for for reaction to the story for us tonight. Mr. Maimane, good evening to you. Thanks for your time. Firstly, what do you make of what the President has announced?
Good evening, Kathy, and good evening to fellow South Africans. Firstly, I find that the President gave us a summary of the Zondo Commission without really the actions that pertain to him not being taken. It is, in fact, deeply disappointing that the same members of cabinet who are implicated in the commission, surely the President has well within his power to be able to ask them to step aside from cabinet. Because that would give a clear indication that the recommendations made in the commission in fact mean something, actually some things that he's serious about. But clearly he wants to protect his fellow comrades. And secondly, I think we need to come to a point where we recognize that the biggest risk and threat to the execution of these recommendations are the ANC. Because if you think about it, it will arrive at a parliament that has a majority led by the ANC. So where recommendations have been made about electoral reform, none of them are in fact taking place. And therefore, I do think if South Africa has to rid itself of state capture, we really need to be able to go to election 2024 so that we can have a government that can fully implement these. The ANC cannot, in this instance, be, as the president has described it, accused number one, also be the referee, and then ultimately seek to arrest its own members. It's impossible. Therefore, we need a sober parliament, a new mandate, and ultimately ensure that we can really get to the end of state capture.
I want to bring our politics editor, Lukanyo Kalata, into this conversation. And just on that point that Mmusi is raising, because when you look at the legislative reforms, the president has pointed to a number of bills and changes that are going to go before Parliament. And at the beginning, he said that, you know, what he's saying tonight is a reflection of his entire cabinet's response to this report. That, of course, I think, like Mmusi, does make one a bit wary in terms of how far will these changes go? How long will it take for them to be implemented? And is it really, again, you know, a case of pushing the can or kicking the proverbial can further down the road?
I think our answer lies in what the ANC has been able to do with the Electoral Amendment Bill. Now, with that bill, Kathy, they were literally ordered by the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court had found that the bill is unconstitutional. Therefore, Parliament must go and relook at that bill and make it constitutional and allow ordinary South Africans like you and I to be able to stand for any election or any position, any office that we so choose in this country. Look what the ANC and Parliament did with that bill. And that was ordered by the Constitutional Court. Now, here it's a recommendation by the State Capture Commission. The president kind of like pre-qualifies that by saying not all of the recommendations are binding. So I don't have to implement all of them. And this about the electoral reform and all of those, I doubt that the ANC is going to get to it, because look at how the ANC treated the Electoral Amendment Bill, which was an order by the Constitutional Court.
Mmusi, effectively, you know, towards the end of his speech, the president really, you know, talking tough on corruption, talking tough against those who are thinking of being corrupt, and that the state will use every single muscle resource to find them and hold them accountable. Does tonight's speech give you a sense of that? That, you know, if you're a corrupt individual and you heard what the president said, you've been implicated in state capture, that you'll go to bed shaking in your shoes?
Not at all, because if the president couldn't take a simple action, which is to reshuffle his executive, which is immediate, I mean, that he doesn't need to have a long conversation about, and give people implicated an opportunity to go fight matters in courts, etc. What hope is there when people are already telling you that they are going to take matters on judicial review, etc., etc.? It is an indicator of the fact that, frankly, this was a speech to subtweet President Zuma, who also made the same statements about the fact that he will fight corruption and all of those things. Kathy, I think as South Africans, we need to realize state capture was committed by a party. President Ramaphosa did not arrive on the scene in 2019. He was there in 2014. He was the second in charge. And so for him to claim, he didn't see any of this would be unfair and certainly not directing the nation. What I feel needs to happen now, what would have been stronger action, would have been to indicate, starting with the executive, demonstrating the fact that the criminal actions are going to take place, and ultimately, where it is well within his power, the president should have acted. And tonight, I'm filled with no less confidence than I was the day before or the week before that, and ultimately handing the process over to Parliament. Sure, has to do the legislative amendments, but ultimately this matter has to go down to criminal prosecution and swift action by the state, and I'm held no confidence that the ANC will take this action.
The president has tasked the work that needs to be done now with Parliament to the deputy president, somebody who's kept a relatively low profile in as far as the work that he does in that office. Do you see him rising to the task of this role? And just how difficult will it be for him to navigate, again, mindful of the separation of powers?
No, certainly not. I mean, in many of these instances, when it comes to legislative reform, Parliament in the last 2 years has not passed any significant legislation, really. And to the political editor's point, we've seen what happened to the electoral reform. So I'm not holding my breath that there'll be suddenly a new set of laws that are able to adjust quick enough for citizens of South Africa to feel the confidence. We're looking at, as the term of this parliament by 2024, I say this without fear of contradiction, that by the end of this term, if there will be no laws passed that substantively strengthen our ability to fight off corruption, because this parliament hasn't had a history of being able to deliver legislative reform that does the job. Certainly, under a parliament that has the majority of the ANC, it would be seen as literally turkeys voting for Christmas. It cannot be that the ANC can self-police or self-correct. It was clear at the end of the Zondo Commission that at the end of state capture that there were people looting in the PPE scandal during a time of COVID. Corruption has in fact gone on. And so to me, the suggestion that suddenly giving Parliament the right to change laws, which it will take its own public consultation process, they failed to keep the 2-year update on the electoral reform one. What will 18 more months to the end of term in 2024 deliver anything differently? Kathy, I really believe as the people of South Africa, we need to take cognizant of this moment. Realize that this is a significant weekend in our democracy. This is where all 4 presidents, living presidents of the country, have spoken. And if there's a theme, it's simply this, that the ANC is corrupt and cannot be trusted with the future of this country.
All right.
That's what we've got to take cognizance of.
Mmusi Maimane, we'll leave it there for tonight.